So welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here. This is the Ecopath online seminar series, and we are today going. Hold on, I need to. Yes, we are going to have a very interesting webinar today. But first of all, just some housekeeping rules. Be sure that you have your name written clearly, so that we know who's asking the questions. If you have a question, use the Q&A. If you have any technical problems, use the chat function, and we will be recording it and making it available on the YouTube channel of the Marine Board and the Ecopath YouTube channel, but we are not live streaming it at the moment. Just for your information, this is a webinar series that happens nominally once every 2 months or so, usually on the last Tuesday of each month, around 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, 6 o'clock Central European Time, and hopefully, possibly, we'll have one at the end of May, or maybe just after that. We're still looking for speakers. So if you have a talk that you want to give, then are we actually looking at the right screen? Are you seeing yourself, Miriam? Yes, good.
Yep.
Okay. So today we have Miriam Püts speaking from the Thunen Institute of Sea Fisheries in Germany, and she is going to give us a great talk about integrating habitat preferences into Ecospace for spatial management and some examples from the Southern North Sea. So without further ado, I shall stop sharing and you can start sharing your screen and take it away, Miriam.
Yes. So, there we go. Thank you, Sheila, for the nice introduction. As Sheila said, my name is Miriam Püts, and I work as a postdoc at the Thunen Institute of Sea Fisheries in Germany. And I would like to tell you a little bit about the work I'm doing there, and mostly work I've been doing during my PhD back in the day, and about the integration of habitat preferences into Ecospace and how we can use this Ecospace to address spatial management questions in the southern part of the North Sea. So this talk will be divided into 2 parts. First, I'm going to talk about the construction of the Ecospace with a focus on the integration of habitat preferences, which is work that was also published in 2020. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about spatial management issues. So when we're constructing an Ecospace model, because it's a spatial model, of course, one of the most important questions is why are species where they are? How do we distribute them correctly to have a good representation of the ecosystem? And one ecological concept we have here is the term of habitat preferences. So back in the day, in 1980s, Johnson defined habitat preferences as the tendency to choose one resource, resource A, over resource B, if they are available in an equal amount. At the same, a few years later, Hall and colleagues further defined this concept as the result of choosing between A and B, and choosing one of them more often than the other one. And then another 11 years later, Arts and colleagues further refined this concept as the ratio of the use of a habitat over its availability conditional to the availability of all habitats. So we can already see that we have a lot of different definitions of what habitat preferences are. There are also quite a lot of slightly different descriptions of what actually is a habitat. And furthermore, we also have ecological niches, which basically are described by the distribution of a species, because it includes biotic and abiotic components. The most traditional way to address this is by calculating species distribution models to address the relationship between a species and environmental parameters. And on the other hand, we have traditional food web or ecosystem modeling, where we have focused more on the biotic components. However, in the last years, especially in Ecospace, we were able to bridge the gap between the species distribution model and the ecosystem modeling. Starting in 2013, where we are now able to drive the Ecospace models with time dynamic external geospatial data to account for shifts in environmental parameters. And then in 2014, the option of the habitat foraging capacity model was implemented, where we now do not only say, is a species in a certain habitat, yes or no, but the habitat can be defined as a continuous relative habitat capacity from 0 to 1, and allows us to define the relationship between species and environmental drivers a bit more precise, and include multiple drivers at the same time. And then just in the recent years, Marta and colleagues were among the first to publish a study where they did not only use environmental drivers from single species models, but also use the niche capacities, so the distribution maps derived from the single species distribution models, to override the capacity and drive the model directly with the knowledge of where species are located. So how does that look in Ecospace? Basically, you have a certain input capacity, and then you follow the path and see if you have a niche distribution driver. So if you want to implement species distribution model results based on the knowledge about the species distribution maps in your ecosystem. If you decide to do that, of course, you need distribution maps you derive from various modeling approaches you can use, like generalized additive modeling, Maxent, Bayesian modeling, and then implement these as niche capacity maps into Ecospace. And the really neat thing is that with the spatial-temporal framework, we can not only implement these maps into Ecospace, but also it allows us to update those maps regularly in order to account for shifts in species distribution right away. So how would that work, or at least how I approached it was I created a base map for Ecospace, and then I used calculated species distribution map, in my case, a generalized additive model, and I predicted the distribution of the species right away onto the grid that I got from the Ecospace base map, and then you integrate into Ecospace over the spatial temporal framework. So you go to the Ecospace tab and then to input, then you click external data, and there you're able to connect your model with the external spatial temporal data and add the habitat capacity maps right away. If you decide not only to use those external maps that sort of override basically the input capacity, but also add on top habitat preferences or environmental preferences, then you can do that, and you can either implement the habitat capacity. So you have, for example, maps like I have for sediment or distance to coast, and you assign a value between 0 and 1 for the species, how favorable the certain habitat is for the functional group. Or you can also go ahead and use the environmental capacity, where you have an environmental driver map. On top, you see, for example, sea surface temperature, and then you have a functional response curve, which that can, then gets linked, and therefore the environmental preference function then drives the distribution in relation to the environmental driver. So coming back to the ecological concepts I talked about in the beginning, the question we asked ourselves for this study was, how do we define habitat preference? Is the habitat preference displayed by, is a species presence, yes or no? Or does the habitat preference mean this is the habitat and this area where we have a lot of this species? So here we have a high abundance. And what works better when we do combine this with a trophodynamic model, such as the Ecospace model? Before I go into the Ecospace, just a few words about the Ecopath and Ecosim model that lie underneath. They were created by Moritz Stepler, Alex Kempf, and Axel Temming in 2016. And it depicts the ecosystem in the southern part of the North Sea. On the right-hand side, you can see the greater North Sea ecoregion, and the darker parts are the model regions for this Ecopath model. This model includes 68 functional groups, 7 of which are multi-stanza groups, 12 fishing fleets, and it was originally built to address fisheries management questions, so it's quite fish-centric, the whole model. So what we looked at was, on the one hand, which type of habitat preference would work best in combination with Ecospace and what would yield the best model fit in the end. So we, as I said, we used generalized additive model and looked at presence absence versus maps that display the abundance of a species. And since we're able to update those maps on a regular basis, we also wanted to check which temporal resolution would yield the best fit to the observed data. So we updated those maps on a seasonal basis every half year. We looked at annual maps, then we looked at mean maps over 5 years. So if it's okay to update the maps, but not too frequently. And also what happens if we just have a simple distribution map and do not account for shifts over time. Since unfortunately Ecospace does not have an incorporated skill assessment routine, we basically build our own skill assessment outside in R, where we checked basically in 3 dimensions the results of the Ecospace model. So we checked only the temporal fit, where we looked at the model efficiency, which accounts for natural variations in the projections, and at the root mean squared error, and for catch only, because for catch we did not have spatial maps to compare them to. We decided to take a third metric into account. We also looked at the Pearson correlation. Then we looked at spatial fit, where we compared the output of Ecospace with the abundance maps and calculated the Schöner's D, which is a niche index. And we looked at the spatial temporal fit, where we created a Taylor diagram. So for the temporal fit here, we have the results for the model efficiency and also for the root mean squared error. I'm not going to talk about all the values in detail, just important to know is that the model efficiency above 0, and it has a better fit than using an average value over time. So this is good. So you want to be above 0 and as high as possible. With the RMSE, it's the other way around. You want to be as close as possible to 0. And we can see that for the presence absence distribution maps that were updated every 5 years, we yielded the best results in terms of temporal fit. We then had a look at each individual functional group, where we ranked the model efficiency for all the different scenarios, so presence absence for the different temporal scales and hurdle as a metric for abundance in the different temporal scales. And we ranked them from 1 to 7, with 1 being the best model, the best fit with the darkest color, and 7 the lightest color. And I'm not going to go into each functional group, but what we could see is that for the hurdle results, so the abundance, overall, the results were just not as good as for the presence absence maps. We also had a bit closer look at the at bigger trophic groups, and what they would favor for mammals and birds. The fit was the best for the presence absence scenario and a seasonal update. Then we had 2 groups, the gadoids and the benthos, for which presence absence updated on an annual basis was best. 2 for multi-year, 2 for the base map. And then we had 1 group where there were the best fit reached for 3 types of scenarios. And 1 group, actually the commercial crustaceans, where the best fit overall was reached with a hurdle, actually. Then when we concentrated on the spatial fit here, those are the results for the Schöner index. We decided that we have a threshold at 50%. So if at least 50% of the map matches with the prediction from the single species distribution model, then we would say that this is quite a good fit, because of course there are trophic interactions that come into play and will change up the map. And we can see here that this is exceeded by most of the functional groups, which yielded quite a nice fit in this case, which is the annual scenario for the presence-absence. And then this is the spatial-temporal skill assessment. Bear with me here, it looks a bit more complex on the first side than it actually is. So on the y-axis and the x-axis, you have the standard deviation. On the outer arc, you have the correlation, and then the green arcs are RMSE values. And you're trying to be as close as possible to the dot that says observation. And then I have blue symbols that represent the hurdle, so the type of abundance maps I used, and then presence-absence is symbolized by red symbols. And we can see that here again, the presence-absence is better in standard deviation and in correlation than the hurdle. Only the RMS, in terms of RMSE and in correlation, but in terms of standard deviation, the hurdle is actually slightly better. But overall, we could see that the presence-absence outperformed the hurdle models. So what does that mean for our use of habitat preferences? What we could see is that the presence-absence maps, which basically display a way broader region in which a species can occur, yielded way better results than the abundance-based hotspot maps, which might be in a single species more precise. However, it does not allow for trophic interactions that well, and thus doesn't represent temporal changes really well. We also could see that it was quite important to account for habitat preferences over time, because the baseline scenario was only a few times the preferred choice. However, for the most species and overall, we could see that implementing those changes improved the model fit. How often those maps should be updated basically depends, again, as much of the other model building in Ecopath on the research question you're asking. And furthermore, we could see that assessing this, the Ecospace output in terms of 3-dimension, temporal, spatial, and spatial-temporal was quite important, because it gave us a bit more information on the best fit in the end. So now I'm going to jump into the second part. I have now my fitted Ecospace model, and it runs quite nicely with the distribution maps. Now I applied it to spatial management question, and luckily 2 days ago, actually, the paper came out concerning the study I've been working on closures to fisheries and the impact on the ecosystem. So, as probably a few of you, most of you are aware, especially in the North Sea, we do have an increase in closure areas to fisheries due to offshore wind installations. In 2020, there was the EU strategy on offshore renewable energy, which now enforces more and more the structural, the increase in renewable energy. And unfortunately, the war also pushed those developments even further. And then we also, at the same time, have a bunch of designated marine protected areas in the area. And with the Biodiversity Strategy 2030 and the EU action plan that targets to protect and restore the marine ecosystem, there is a lot of push towards closing those regions for demersal fisheries and to protect the ecosystems. So therefore, I think it's quite important to address what this would actually do with the ecosystem at hand. So the aim of the study was to analyze the impacts of those closures, because of course, when we do close areas to fisheries, we do have a fishery fishing effort reallocation, and this is impacting the ecosystem. And we can, of course, also assume that there are some type of trade-offs. Then furthermore, we analyzed some theoretical closures to see what would happen if other parts of the ecosystem would be not under pressure of under fishing pressure. And last but not least, we looked at the impact of also reducing the fishing effort and not only redistributing the effort in the area. All of this we did with the ECOIND plugin that Jeroen and Marta published in 2017 in order to analyze the results in terms of ecological indicators. So here you can see the 4 different types of fishing restrictions we applied. On the top left, we have the offshore wind farms. Those are the currently implemented offshore wind farms and the planned wind farms. By the time I started the study, I think right now the most current version even includes even more. And in the case of offshore wind farms, we closed all grid cells to all fisheries we have in the model. On the right-hand side, you can see the MPAs. Here we also have the existing offshore wind farms in the model because they are just there. And we have 3 types of closures to the MPAs. We defined the closure because not all MPAs do have management measurements in place. We looked at the ecological component that we're meant to protect and decided to close based on those ecological components. So if the component was the seafloor and the benthic habitat, we closed those regions for bottom contacting gears. And if they were meant to protect birds and seals, we closed the areas for drift and fixed nets and also gears using hooks. And some MPAs were meant to protect both, and there we excluded all static and bottom contacting gear. And as I said before, we also looked at 2 theoretical scenarios, the Kempton's Q scenario as a measurement of biodiversity, and the IUCN scenario as an implication for an area with high biomass in red listed species. So the Kempton's for both, we ran the ECOIND without any closures. Then we extracted the results and picked out the 30% of the cells with the highest biomass, with the highest Kempton's Q and the highest IUCN biomass in it, and closed those off to have those 30% that the Biodiversity Strategy 2030 is aiming to close in the region. Keep in mind, those are just theoretical scenarios to see what would happen to the ecosystem. And here we decided to also close them for bottom contacting gears and static nets, similar to the MPAs with the most protection. For the offshore wind farms, we also added a layer of hard substrate because it also introduces a new, well, in the muddy North Sea type of new habitat and increase in hard substrate. And so we account for this shift as well. Here are the results for the biomass-based indicators. So we looked at all 4 scenarios in terms of overall impact on, which is the left column, inside the MPAs, which is the middle column, and outside. I'm not going to talk about all the indicators. I'm just going to focus on 2 here as an example. So for one, we have fish biomass, and what we could see in the middle column, we do have a increase in fish biomass inside the MPAs, even a quite strong one for the IUCN scenario, while at the same time, we do have a strong decrease in biomass outside of the MPA. And except for the IUCN scenario, this decrease outside, the increase inside is not able to counterbalance the decrease we can see outside of the MPA. So we're actually losing fish biomass by closing those areas. The similar picture we can see for the IUCN species biomass here. When we look at the distribution maps of those indicators, on the left-hand side, we have total biomass. In my model, total biomass is 80% or even more invertebrate biomass, so the lowest trophic level. which are prone to a lot of predation. And we can see that the greenish color is an increase in biomass and the blue color is a decrease. That outside of those closed areas, we do have an increase in biomass, while inside we have a decrease. And really nicely, we can see the contrasting effect for the fish biomass, so the predator biomass, where we do see an increase inside those closed areas. And we can see also the shapes of the MPAs and the offshore wind farms and the decrease outside. As I said before, one issue here, if we close so many areas to the fisheries, of course, the effort is going to redistribute and then increase in the remaining fishing regions. Therefore, we went ahead and calculated the percent of effort that would have been in the closed areas and took that away from the original effort, and then ran the scenarios again for the three large closures, so for MPA, IUCN, and the Kempton. And here you can see again the biomass-based indicators. Now we have the light colored is the original scenario, and the dark colors are the reduction, other scenarios with the effort reduction. And what we can see now here, we have IUCN species biomass, that inside we even have a stronger increase in biomass, but really interestingly, now we also get even just a tiny bit, but we do get an increase in biomass and therefore a stronger increase in biomass overall in the entire area, and therefore a positive impact of the closures to fishing. We also looked at all the scenarios in terms of trade-off and put them relative to each other. So we have the positive impact on the y-axis and the negative impact on the x-axis. And we can see that there are quite a few scenarios which have similar positive impacts and then vary around the negative impacts. However, which is quite interesting is scenario number 7, which has a really strong positive impact in terms of increase in biomass inside, and at the same time, due to the loss in fishing and catch, we do have the strongest negative impact for this scenario. So there is a strong difference when you compare the scenario to, for example, the Kempton scenario, which is the 6 in the location. It's the same amount of cells that were closed. They're just located in a different area, and it has quite a different impact in terms of trade-offs between positive and negative impacts. So what could we learn from that? If we want to make sure that the closed areas are a success, we might actually need to consider additional fisheries management actions such as effort reductions. However, there's also no silver bullet. We always will run into trade-offs, and we always will have compromises. There will be winners and losers, and not only between the economical sectors, but also within the food web. And what we could see, especially when comparing the Kemptons and the IUCN and the large closures to the offshore wind farms, that size and placement of the area is really, really strong importance. However, there are some things we need to consider in this study, and when looking at the results, this study only considered closure to fishery and therefore redistribution of the fishing effort and a small increase in hard substrate. What we did not include is the impact of construction or deconstruction of offshore wind farms, and also not the impact of noise that offshore wind farm can have on certain species, or connectivity sprawls and impacts like that. Furthermore, what we did not include is a recovery of bentos to the reduction of fishing impact, which would probably increase the positive impact of the MPAs furthermore, as we could see them for now. And with that, I would like really to thank my collaborators and colleagues, and this work was conducted also a little bit into Project Seawise and BioWeb, and I would like to thank you all for listening, and I'm free for questions now.
Thank you very much, Miriam. That was great.
Thank you.
I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen,
Yeah.
and then we can take some questions. I'm not seeing any questions coming in from anybody yet, but I see Willie has his hand raised. So Willie, do you? Hi, Carl. Willie, Kim, can I ask you, is there anything you want to ask before? Because you have to go. Sorry, Willie.
Sure, I have a question, and great talk, Miriam. This question came from kind of on your last slide. You had something about recovery of bentos, and there's some studies coming out of the region of your model that trawling can sometimes increase productivity of bentos, and that may, increase secondary productivity or dose feeding on that. Is there any way to include that in your model?
So with the BioWeb project, I'm actually looking into this right now. So I started doing a review on all the impacts and papers I could see from the region. Right now, it's quite hard, I think. I think it's easier to include the impact of the fishing directly in terms of, okay, hard-shelled species are less impacted than soft-shelled, for example. This, I think, is easier, but also the recovery rates after taking away the fishing pressure is quite diverse, because you would need the fishing effort in each grid cell and also the gear depth penetration in the end. And so there's a lot of factors coming in. I tried to figure out how to include that, because I would love to try that out, but I think it's still in the process of getting there.
Right. Thank you.
Welcome.
Oh, just a quick interject something there is what Kim's talking about is when you're trawling area, it shifts from larger, slow-growing macroorganisms towards smaller, more productive ones. So a simple way of modeling it is just to have at least two benthic biomass groups, a small productive high turnover biomass group and a larger structure forming slow turnover biomass.
Yeah, so I think in the current model, I have like 8 or 10 benthic groups, so it's quite highly resolved. So I would probably be able to at least have different in impact. So I have infauna and epifauna, and then different movement patterns from sedentary, like grown species that grow on things, and then species that move slowly and fast moving species. And so I think I could do there a little bit of a difference in impact and changes in biomass of those species.
Thanks, Carl.
So-
Thanks. Kim, do you have one more? Kim, do you have any other questions if you have to leave?
No, I'm good, but thanks a lot, and I'll be disappearing in a minute.
Thanks. So, Carl, did you want to go first, or Willie, do you still have your hand up?
Age before beauty.
So,
Thank you.
Carl.
So, Miriam, that was an excellent talk.
Thank
Fascinating. Now, there's a basic mathematical thing that says that MPAs can only increase the yield of a fish species if it's being overharvested over the area as a whole. If it's not being overharvested, MPAs can only cause a loss in yield. That's sort of by definition of what we mean by optimally harvesting. So did you look at how much the yield loss depended on the stock status for the fish stocks that you looked at? Because my understanding is that most of that part of the North Sea, most of those stocks are pretty well rebuilt to the levels near those that produce maximum sustainable yield, in which case you can only lose yield from an economic value, no matter how effort gets redistributed.
Yeah, I did not look specifically into it, but it's right. The stocks are doing quite well right now. I mean, cod is basically gone from the southern part of the North Sea. But yeah, no, it was more looking into the direct impact.
So the cod is in bad shape. Right? If that's so, and if the ICES stock assessments show its current biomass to be well below BMSY, then an MPA, you should show net benefits for any species that happens for the IC's assessments.
If I might ask a question to you, Carl, on that, and I don't really know if this is true, but if the cod assessment is not just for the southern North Sea, but actually for the whole of the North Sea, then maybe I'm kind of thinking of climate change impacts and the fact that the cod might be moving further north. And even if it's assessed for the whole of the North Sea and it seems okay, it might still not be doing well in the southern part of the North Sea. So
that just means the maximum sustainable yield in the southern part, if they are distinct stocks, is lower.
Yeah.
If they're not distinct stocks, it's kind of interesting that if it's mixing to the south and the fish aren't doing as well in the south, then actually the best strategy is to fish them out.
I'm sure the fishermen will be happy to hear that.
Yeah, they're not. It says that they're not sustainable as a stock. They're just being fed by the northern stock, and they're not contributing back to it. So you might as well just take them.
Yeah. I think the reference points right now are for the total stock. There is an acknowledgement that there are sub parts of the stock. So we'll see how that goes in the future.
Willie?
Yes, Miriam, that was an excellent talk. And not that I'm surprised. I was expecting this. It was also very dense. There was so much material in it. So I must say, I came to think that I'm really happy that this was recorded because I will need to see it again.
Thank you.
There were some surprises in it, in your fittings. So that's why I really need to do it. One thing for the second part of it was that it really made me think about how we're using biodiversity indicators, or even almost our lack of biodiversity indicators. Not that we don't have many, but when we try to compress it into one indicator like Kempton's, or for that matter Shannon's, but that we have as well, they're both doing the same. They're looking at evenness across. And yes, that may be one measure of it, but the underlying biodiversity, we don't handle that well when we're compressing things into one indicator. Have you thought of? You must have thought about that, given that you've gone from species to using Kempton's. Can you see any way out? What's the way forward? Basically, that's what I'm struggling with.
So I think what my approach was basically to look at everything because when you have the IUCN species, for example, those are more the elasmobranchs and some fish, and so you get an idea of the individual components of the ecosystem, not completely about the diversity. That I don't know if we can handle that somehow differently, but it was the best thing to look at all the indicators and then also see some surprises. For example, I had the issue that mammals and birds as one indicator decreased strongly even with the implementation of the MPAs. And the result of that was because I have one group surface feeding seabirds, which feed on discards. And of course, when the fishing is going down, the discard is going down. And then this had a strong reaction in the indicator. And so for me, the study showed that I really need to look into the detail, even the individual functional groups, to see all the impacts that are happening. Yeah.
Very, very often we can't do that. We need to come up with an indicator. In your case here, comparing Kempton and IUCN, they are night and day. They are really very different. So, and I'm struggling with this, and I really would like to see more ideas, more studies for how do we do this.
Yeah, I think they were so different also because I think one part that comes in, especially with the Kempton, so in the North Sea, we have this 50-meter barrier. And so we have those species that are more from the north, and then those species more from the south. And in the region where we see high Kempton's Q values, north and south mix. And so we do have their high abundance or high Kempton's Q, while those species with IUCN are more prone to the really productive region along the coastlines. So,
Jacob.
Thanks. Yeah, Jacob, go.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Miriam. That was an amazing talk. I think the work you've done is incredible, and I think it's a point we all want to start getting to. I know when I see the work that you've done, it's like I want to do that. I want to copy that, and I want to make that happen for the model areas I work on, because it seems like the policy at the moment is far outpacing the research. So the questions are coming in thick and fast about marine spatial prioritization, where MPA should go, what the trade-offs going to be for offshore wind, and the tool that you've developed is perfect for that, right? As a toolbox of other tools to complement it. And I was wondering, how long does it take, asking for a friend, to get from like an Ecosim point to what you've developed? You know what I mean? Because I think everyone wants to get there, and the questions are coming in thick and fast now, but realistically, how long does it take to get to that point we can start giving evidence and advice?
yeah, so I think, well, it depends on a lot of factors. For me, it took a while, to be honest, but that was also because when I started, especially implementing those species distribution maps, like I was the third or fourth person doing that after Marta. And so I needed to understand how that works, and getting from there to having my ready Ecospace, that just took me a while. I mean,
yeah.
I think the MPA started, it was around about 2 to 3 years, give or take. And I mean, I had to learn EWE, so I don't know if there's like a pre-knowledge of EWE. I mean, we met all in Scotland in Oban when I was like not knowing anything about them all. But I think if you have a working knowledge of EWE, if you know how Ecopath and Ecosim works, and then if you know what you want to implement, like do you have species distribution maps, or do you just have environmental drivers because you know for your region that makes more sense. I think this can go a bit faster, but at the same time, I think what you said, we are actually being outpaced a bit by the questions. And of course, we're asked more and more, can you give us information about that? And can you, like, in the next month or in the next weeks? And you're like, yeah, I would like to, but I want to give you the right answers, and I want to make sure that it's like good and proper research. So yeah,
this is all I hear, and it ends up you're giving advice and you're having to give almost a page of caveats as well, of where we'd like to be, if you had the resource and the capacity, this is what you could do. At the moment, your question needs a 2-month turnaround, this is what you can do in that time. I don't know, I think it's really cool. And is there kind of like a centralized, I don't know, with Ecospace, like GitHub of all this code that people have been using to make base maps and stuff like that? Is that available to kind of speed up the process of doing this?
No, I don't think so, but I think it would be really good to put that out there, and then also maybe like a page on what I've ran into a few of issues that if I would have known them prior, then I would have avoided them. And I think a page like that, not only like the forum, but really a user page where they can put questions, or hey, I realize that this and this is happening when I run the model. That would be really nice and good to implement that.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so maybe the question about the GitHub type place is really a question for Willy. I don't know if given that Jeroen is not here, if does the Ecopath consortium or the programmers have a place where this kind of information can be, and how people have actually created R code that takes, I mean, I know Jacob's done some of that and Miriam's done some of that. So is there one place where people can find it? Because I think we need that.
Yeah.
The short answer is no. We have looked at GitHub, but it calls for someone actually being dedicated to run it. It's not simple. I find it a struggle with it. But I would like to mention a related activity, which is that our user guide is 14 years out of date, and there is no textbook. And that's changing. both things. So we're working on it now. We will have a version ready for the conference in June, Ecopath 40. And that version is going to be an open textbook and user guide, multi-authored. Carl and I are taking the lead on it, and it will happen. So, Miriam, if you would write a page about those experiences, they will be there. It's online, it's open, it's easy to update, and it's very, very easy to find things in it. I can see that even now when we have the structure of it, we're working on it, we're adding things to it. So if you go in there and you just write a search term, you can see where in this material you have that. So I can think that's going to be the easy, accessible thing for everyone, and easy to update, and much easier to find your way around than GitHub for someone who's not experienced.
Like me. Thanks, Billy. Carl?
Yeah, just want to follow up on Billy's thing there. From what I've seen with Billy students trying to use this framework, they really had to go to Jerome and Joe Bazowski for help over and over to figure out how to do this at all. And I assume you probably did too, Miriam, because you're in contact with them. So right now, I suspect, Jakob, that if you just sat down and tried to do it by yourself, it'd be almost impossible. And those students took months to figure stuff out, even with the backup and help. It's the GIS kind of information handling side of it that is a nightmare for a lot of us. It's not I'm not sure you can put that in a user's guide in any kind of sensible way. But just one other quick question. How did you set the dispersal distances, dispersal rates by the groups? Did you vary those a lot? Because the MPA FC really depends on how fast and how far you assume the organisms disperse. You didn't play with that, or play with what it did to your fitting? Or?
So I started off with just the dispersal rate 330, 300, those rule of thumb. But I similar, yeah, but I extended it a bit more for larger foraging fish and then for top predators to make them a bit faster, to have a little bit more of a divergence between the different species, to account a bit more for the faster moving species. But I kind of like really talked, I think it was like a year ago or something, or have a year, WGE West, I'm just having trouble pronouncing those acronyms, about really, it would be so good to have a better test and handling on the dispersal rates, and maybe do some runs there and compare different dispersal rates. And so this would be good, but yeah, limited time.
There's that pesky having to finish your PhD thing coming in all the time.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons I asked that is that relative performance of a smooth habitat preference type thing versus a yes/no depends partly on how the movement rates get varied for biomass that is inside or outside or is along that habitat gradient. So it could be that some of your conclusions about the simpler spatial yes/no habitat model working better may have been partly at least because of the dispersal screw-ups that can occur in the continuous habitat preference model. It may be screwing up the mixing rates quite a bit, dispersing animals into bad habitats more than it should. Some goofy thing, we don't know.
Jacob,
Yeah, thank you.
have a question as well?
Yeah, this might be for other people as well. But I was wondering with the fisheries displacement when you close the MPA, I imagine that currently the way it works is it displaces fishing effort to somewhere else within your model region. But I know in reality, for example, in the North Sea, we saw with some total algal catches dropped for some pelagic fish, and nomadic vessels were displaced from the North Sea into the Channel Sea. So a different ecosystem model in terms of how we would work. And I was wondering, is there a way to address that in Ecospace, or not really?
No, the current version finally does. So effort, there's a nowhere effort option.
Okay.
So when abundances go down and fishermen would just give up, that's modeled as non-fishing.
Mhm.
So total effort now should respond. Isn't that right, Billy? That's in the core code?
Yes, we can do. It certainly is going to be in the next release. We have been working quite a bit on it, and it's an aspect that's really important for handling choke species as well. We can for allocating for choke species. However, it doesn't solve the problem that when things are happening outside your model area, you are not modeling it.
Mhm.
So if you want to model that, then you need to have
A big model.
4, B, C,
Larger
D,
model.
7, C,
Yeah.
D, E, and so on. You need to increase your model area.
Let's go, Jacob.
I'm so glad that my teachings come back when I kept on saying you can't model, salmon if you don't model whole of the North Pacific. I just had a flashback from my teaching days.
Oh,
So I'm so glad it's
You should-
back still here.
you should see some beautiful spatial salmon modeling that Fanny Couture is finishing now. Oh, you can model salmon. Oh, yes.
I know
Well,
it's
maybe-
not that you can't model them, it's that you have a hidden assumption that while they're not in your system, they're not doing anything interesting.
Yeah.
There's nothing bad happening to them outside. This is one of the most common causes of model failures, things that hit the system from outside your boundaries, things you treat as constants aren't.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's always going to happen. It's going to happen at all models, eventually to all models, at all scales.
Yeah. Yeah, but if you
Burned by the details and burned by the boundaries. Let's say. Yeah.
Okay, I have had no questions from the online participants, which is quite sad. And before people arrived, we were talking about the fact that this webinar feature is actually completely unnecessary. And next time we will just have a meeting and people can be in, and we won't have a us and them situation so everybody can talk. And I will make sure that people are muted and all of that stuff. So if none of the online participants want to ask any questions, I don't know if there's any questions from you, Santiago. You've been very quiet in the corner there.
I've been really impressed about this talk, and I've been enjoying the conversation. And Jacob actually asked the question about where do you put the remaining effort. That was what I was interested in. But like this is great work, and like thanks for paving the way. Yeah, it's really nice.
So Jacob, go.
I have a quick question. No, if no one else is asking a question, but I was at a meeting the other day with a few biogeochemical modelers, and they were all talking about the impacts of offshore renewables on stratification and the change in nutrient uptake by phytoplankton and stuff like that. And I was wondering, has that been taken into account in Ecospace yet by anyone? Because I know every time I've seen offshore wind, it's either been noise or substrate impacting the food web. But I was wondering, has anyone tried coupling outputs with like a biogeochemical model to see how wind waves can change ecosystem?
So I was actually, as I told you, at WGIPEM while you were hosting WGEA West, whatever. And we were discussing exactly that because it's a group for modeling integrated eco-physiological impacts. And there are a lot of people working on the lower trophic level and on this compartments, and it would be really nice to get together and do something in terms of that, and also connectivity sprawls. And so I think there's a lot more meat in there and things that could be done, and I think it would be a possibility, but I haven't heard of anyone doing it actually.
Okay, cool.
So I mean, I would imagine, because certainly the biogeochemical link to Ecospace has been done with Chiara's group for that paper that Jacob and I were part of, and some other people here, I imagine. And I know that the people in Italy have done some of that linking as well. So I'm not sure if there's other models, but to actually specifically look at the, the kind of stratification issue, I don't know if that's ever been looked at.
No, we also have work here, noted Greg Oldford, on that integration with biochemical models or dynamic models more narrowly. But one other thing I want to bring up here, which I haven't talked about, is Miriam, you asked a question about impact on noise. And there has been a few examples of this. One comes from Sheila's lab back in Open. And another one is from Roberts Bank, where we evaluated the impact of construction noise on a number of species. So that is feasible, absolutely. And it would be an addition.
And the impact of noise is taken into account in the MSP challenge for sure. So the work is done on how to link it up already. You just need to, I guess, figure out how they did it. But it's been done before, so yeah. All right. If there's no other questions, then I will just say thank you very much, Miriam. It was great. It was good to hear what you've been up to, and to say that we are looking for speakers for the next one. That we have 2 people that we will be contacting. But if anybody else wants to talk, and Billy, you were talking about somebody doing some work on salmon, so maybe we could have a talk by that person at some stage. It would also be nice. So let me know, and we can set up another webinar. It'd be great to keep on top of it. And just a call out again to remind you that the Ecopath 40 conference will be next June 2024 in Belgium. So looking forward to see you guys. Oh no, Billy must have the last word.
In that context, we are going to open up the website pretty soon. On the website, we have a pre-registration. And if anyone's interested in running half-day courses after the workshop, we're putting a list on the pre-registration to get a sense for which of these courses should we actually run. So if you have suggestions for half-day courses, do send them to me, and I'll put them on the list.
Yeah. And we will have probably a usual, introduction to Ecopath course for those poor students that are desperately trying to figure out how it works, which will run for about 2.5 days. So that probably will happen anyway.
The website is ecopath40.org. So if you want to see what we have on that list now, go to ecopath40.org.
Is it live already, really?
Yes, it's live.
Okay.
But it's live, but it's very, 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 very incomplete. It doesn't have all the logos and all the things and all the text and so on. But the structure is there, and especially the pre-registration.
Yeah.
The list there. That's what I want you to look at.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you again, Miriam. It was great, and thank you everybody else for attending. And we'll see you guys soon. Take care.